My name is Karl Sharro, and I'm a partner at PLP Architecture in London. We are an international practice of about 150 architects, and many of us have had a long experience of working in the Middle East, as well as other parts of the world. And some of us, like myself, have a background from the region. I have Lebanese and Iraqi origins myself. And what I wanted to talk to you about today, and actually it's not a talk in my mind, it's more of a part of an exchange, because this is the third of a series that I've been doing in the Gulf. The first two sessions were in Dubai and Kuwait City, and this is the third one now in Riyadh, and it's about an ongoing research project called Notes on the New Arab City, and we're hoping to publish this as a book in the coming years. And volume 1 is called The Gulf, and we really wanted to start with the Gulf because I think of the dynamism and the rapid urbanization of the region and the potential that we see for urban development. And what we wanted to do was not just to offer our expertise, but to listen, to understand what are sort of the aspirations in the region and how can we as architects and urbanists respond to them. And I have a kind of some presence on social media, so I chose to begin this exercise with what I find a very useful medium for exchange, which is Twitter. I specifically asked about, young people in particular, how all aspects of their life have changed from their parents and what are their expectations for the future. And I received many, many responses. There's a samples of them over here, but it highlighted to me many of the aspects that I think are not, when people talk about the Gulf in the West, they sometimes tend to have a stereotypical view of what happens in the Gulf that doesn't really look at the complexity of life and the challenges ahead, but as well the aspirations, the ambitions, and the huge potential that a young generation can offer. So this was sort of an intro into the topic, some of which we took out as headlines that we keep referring to. As a result, we structured our research into 10 big themes. I'm going to talk, I think, about 8 of them today. The key one, obviously, being urbanism and the fast and phenomenal pace of urban change in the region over the past 30, 40 years. This example, could be repeated across the region. We don't want this to be a Dubai-centric exercise, but I think there's a variety of urbanization that's quite phenomenal, but also I think represents a big challenge. If you look across the region, and I think, you're in the largest, effectively, city, which is achieved metropolis status in my mind, and it's set to continue growing, but there are several other cities in the region that are also fast growing and expanding. And this is, regardless of where we're here today about the post-COVID world and the death of the city, I think this is unjustified pessimism myself, but we can come to that in more detail. I think there are a lot of grand ambitions, big schemes for development, and they have quite a kind of an inspirational scale. But I think, and one of the key topics that I want to come to is, I think this growth has happened not only in the Gulf, but it could be China, it could be India, it could be other parts of the world, has happened largely based on a model that's almost 100 years old today, which is that of the extruded modern city with its high rises, open space, and particularly the reliance on the car for urban transport. And I think this model functioned very well as a transition away from the 19th century city. It provided a lot of housing for people in Europe, North America, and across the world with higher living standard, but it's also creaking and it's time for new ideas. And if I just take you to this sketch from Le Corbusier's Ville Contemporaine from 1922, look beyond the stylistic element, and you can see the cities that a lot of us live in today in terms of the form of the architecture, and particularly the dominance of the car. And as a sort of as an in-joke, this was the reality was promised, but I think what happened was more like this. And you're familiar, of course, with the notorious traffic jams, which is, again, it's not a specific problem to the Gulf. Many cities in the world, nor is it specific to Dubai. You can see it on King Fahd Road in Riyadh. And this is one aspect of where I think this model, with its over-reliance on the car and functional zoning and extruded freestanding plots, is unable to meet the demands of urban growth for the future. Nor does it just stop at that. I think when it comes to the Gulf, something very important has been lost in the historical and cultural continuity of how we live, or how people in the Gulf live. While the standard of housing maybe internally is very good, and a lot of it has been provided, but the idea of these individual plots that are inward looking with streets that nobody would ever wish to walk on have quickly kind of eroded the traditional Arab street or the shaded tighter urban fabric with its all social and cultural possibilities. So we end up with a kind of more of a quasi-suburban model implanted in cities. And again, this is not as a kind of a critique of what has been achieved, but as thinking of how we can, now that we've overcome some of the challenge of the first periods of building, how can we start to look at different models that satisfy more some of these cultural aspects? Could we even begin to start looking at a tighter fabric that's more suitable, not just from a cultural point of view, but climatically, because it provides a lot of shading and closer interaction, not by way of nostalgia. We see a lot of ways for integrating technology in this environment, but as a way to start to think beyond the urban model that we've inherited from modernism. One of the things that we're trying to do actually is to start to look at, and this is a software that developed, platform that we've developed internally in the office, is this sort of virtual reality, real-time design. And we're showing just an aspect of what it does now by adjusting the height of different blocks and then applying real-time thermal analysis. So you see the red zones are the zones that receive the highest heat radiation. And as we make buildings taller or make them closer to each other, then you start to get more shading and a cooler environment. So obviously this is done for illustrative purposes. It has much more potential, but I think with the technology that we have at our disposal today, we are not as limited in our tools as earlier generations of architects are, but we also, I think, have a responsibility to start to pay more attention to these climatic factors. And there we dream of creating more tightly knit fabric that is still modern, that is still aspirational, but has that energy and the buzz and kind of tries to draw on historic themes in how we design cities. The second aspect of this, and I think urbanism is not done, obviously, it's a kind of underlying theme to the whole presentation and the research in the book, is what we called interaction. And by interaction, we are specifically talking about the making of public places and the nature of social interaction in them. And I think you all recognize this image, which has been dominant in terms of promoting cities in the Gulf, where it has shopping at its heart. And I'm not a kind of a moralist. I don't have an issue with shopping, but I think the reality is that Gulf cities and Arab cities in general have much more to them. This is something that a young Uber driver in Riyadh said to me, and I think it's not actually true when you start looking for things to do, but it reflects a lot of sentiment about the dominance of the shopping malls in the region. And again, I'm not a kind of a moralist. I don't want to condemn, like many people do, condemn shopping malls on almost moralist grounds. I think there's a place of them, but I think there's also a very interesting challenge about how we deal with this typology, which is so prevalent. Now, clearly, the Gulf has much more public interaction aspect beyond the shopping malls. It's not what we see in advertising. There are spiritual, religious aspects, there's sports, there's culture, there are all sorts of things that are happening that deserve attention. But there are also layers to cities in the Gulf that include the migrant experience, that include popular markets, aswaq shabiya, and there are several layers that I feel don't receive enough attention, and you get much more kind of superficial representation. And our thesis here is any beginning of new thinking about cities in the Gulf needs to pay attention to this diversity of experience. And how do we do that, and why? I want to draw to your attention to this, moving from the shopping mall and its social dominance and the kind of the arrival of e-commerce, which I think the whole story of COVID is going to, and its aftermath is going to accelerate it hugely. And this is in effect what we've been ending with in North America and increasingly now Western Europe as well, is the shopping mall as ruin. The shopping malls, some of which have been built less than 5 years ago, are completely disused now because they're losing their social function. Now, I realize we're still far from this stage in the Gulf, but I think there should be a thinking about how do we kind of increase the resilience of these spaces, because they do work, and they work for a very important reason, which is they provide the right climate for social interaction, which might be absent for long periods of the year in the Gulf with the heat and other climatic factors. Some of the things we started to think about, can we move the shopping mall and the dominance of the idea of shopping from it and start to make it almost part of the city, making use of this nucleus of interaction that could be climatically more suitable to start bringing schools in, libraries, museums, and a lot of these things have been happening. But can we even transition the central space of the shopping mall into the idea of the town square? And like every parent, I'm always keen to recruit my children to do some things for me. So this is when my children were 7 and 9. I kind of discussed this idea with them, and I said, can you draw some ideas for me? Can you see the shopping mall being something else? And they started putting, tube stations, subway station, libraries, toy stores are obviously very important for children. And I thought this is a very important test. If it works with children, then there's potential there, because this is the generation we're ultimately going to be designing for. And again, you can see kind of from this chaos of idea, I think for me, there was a lot of kind of exciting potential in there. And one of the things that we have been doing, and I think as a practice recently, is reinventing the workplace in collaboration with others. So this is our scheme for Sky Central here in London, where the challenge was to design in a part of the city that's not very urban in nature, a self-contained campus, to recreate a sense of the city within a building and transform the activity of working from the standardized, everybody has the same desk, to a much more exciting space that has a lot of amenity and, has the friendliness of timber, it's filled with light, has a lot of greenery, gives a sense of well-being. And you can see when you're on the ground floor in this, you have the experience of almost like being part of the city. And I think you can begin to see how with this transformation of the workplace, how those kind of intervention can begin to happen within shopping malls as they phase away from shopping, which won't disappear completely, but they can start to adapt to different activities. This is in a kind of a previous iteration, the Zayed Stadium in Abu Dhabi, which is a competition we participated in, where our thought went around, again, recreating that kind of, the urban piazza for the Gulf environment, trying to rely not on air conditioning throughout, but this light kind of skinned ETFE bubble, and then trying to use more passive cooling techniques and trying to, again, recreate this experience of the public piazza in a way suitable for the Gulf. But as the years passed and as we see kind of the the future of shopping mall, I think there's a huge potential in there. And ultimately what we want to see with it is, can we start to link up those shopping malls, carve them up and connect them to the city, so we get to this scale of urban intensity and level of activity that we see, you know, across the Gulf, but functioning almost as a connected part of the city. In order to achieve a lot of the aspirations that we're looking at, and I'll admit before I do this section, that a lot of the ideas here are intentionally provocative. They're, I don't like the word utopian, but they're kind of exploring the what ifs, and some of them are more immediate. So there'll be different kind of notions of that. And I want you to pay attention to this statement. We're all familiar with the background, how, you know, the kind of women were allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, and the kind of the positive reception of that message. But the reality is, a female child born in Saudi Arabia today may never need to drive. And the reason for that is we're heading towards a completely different technology, primarily through self-driving cars that are going to be much more efficient and much better, are integrating with the city fabric, but through a whole range of alternative mobilities, many of which we've started to see across the Gulf and many parts of the world. So there's a whole new world that's emerging, and what we're trying to respond to here is this idea that the new city will require new forms of mobility, will require a new urban thinking. We've been developing this idea for a system called CarTube, which combines in our mind the benefits of both public transport and the private car, the convenience of the private car with the capacity and the efficiency of public transport through a fleet of self-driving cars. So nobody needs to own a car, you order it on your app. But more importantly, they're removed from the streets of the city and buried in these underground networks. In this case, in Stockholm, it's illustrated underwater, where we were able, through our studies, to illustrate that this system would be much more efficient and allow us to reduce the space on surface that's used currently for car in cities and free up that space for things that we're going to see in a minute. And why do we need to do that? If we looked again at Sheikh Zayed Road in Dubai, it's about 60-meter width and it goes on for miles. And you can think of the area that's being utilized for that, but it's not also the area take up, it's the fact that it disconnects the city and it's not open space that you can use. And obviously, if you look at King Fahd Road as well in Riyadh and across the region, you can see examples of that occurring. And I'm sure you're all familiar with some of the issues associated with that. So let's look at a typical city today, and this is the take-up. The majority of what we have, you know, the linear network of open space is dedicated to vehicular activity. Simply what would happen if we remove those cars and bury them underground, we can reclaim all of that space. We can activate it, we can fill it with greenery, we can allow people to cycle and pedestrians to use it. We can start to design cities with a much tighter urban fabric, which I think is a very important factor to take into consideration in the Gulf in particular. And you can see here, for example, the network activated and how we can produce a much tighter grain. You can see this three-dimensionally as well. And the next point was, why only put this alternative mobility? And it could be self-driving pods, it could be maglev vehicles, all sorts of ideas can get unlocked once we start to move away from our understanding of the car today. Can we elevate them? Can we elevate them and use different morphologies as long as these networks are continuous and produce a variety of sections across the city? And can we hook them all together to start to create this three-dimensional realities and system of movements? And this ties up to a dream that architects have had for a long time now, which is the three-dimensional city and streets in the sky, a very old idea that I think has a lot of resonance today. And the idea of, as far as we've been able to do it now, it's been about connecting within the same plot. But could we start to envision these as systems of mobility as well, would allow us to free the ground plane? So with a very simple sketch, if we looked at Dubai or another city based on this extrusion, can this sort of activity start to occur? And I think we're starting to see a lot of architectural examples. Is this sort of thinking, could we push it to the next step? And again, this is one of the old images when we started to look at that. What would happen to the city if the movement plane moves from the ground floor up into the sky, and what does it do to the ground plane? And again, with the kind of a quick illustration of that, and I think credit to Dubai and many other Gulf cities to the integration of metro systems and public transport, but we can see the dominance of the car and the space that it takes. Can we start to replace it with this type of environment? And what would happen once we start to do that? And we kind of developed a little bit the typologies that start to explain at a diagrammatic level how these connections start to happen. This is part of a whole system of kind of urban thinking that we're doing of different typologies that are designed three-dimensionally. And in this case, it would be robotics that are connecting them, but starting to look at this architectural typologies that move away from the extruded plot into much more joined up three-dimensional environments. And if we kind of look through sectionally how they start to work and the variety they give us and the open space that is usable and climatically adequate, I think there's a huge potential in there. So again, we would take this model of the extruded city and start to look at these connectivities that can emerge. All sorts of things can happen. We can look at, you know, a long time ago, someone said to me, Dubai is too dense. And I said, no, the problem, it's not dense enough. And I think it's ready for the next step, and many other cities in the region as well, with these connectivities, the horizontal skyscrapers. And you can distinguish between the orange and the blue, which could, you know, adapt these alternative mobilities, the electric vehicles, the self-driving vehicles, the flying drones. I think there's a huge potential there from the fabric of the city to reinvent a new city. And as well, what that would allow us to do is, again, free up this ground plane and start to design spaces that work for the climate, work for the culture, work for the activity, and start to transition the model of the city. The next aspect is the workplace, which is intimately kind of connected to all the discussion, and it's one of the areas where we have the most experience. And again, I think a lot of the resonance that we started to pick up in our conversation is the kind of, there's a moment of transition in the Gulf, and some of it is kind of worrying for people because they don't have probably the same job security, but it also offers a lot more opportunities. And could we feed into that, into how we design buildings? Particularly that we're looking at huge kind of demographic bulge in the youth sector. And I think the problem across the Arab world is a lot of people think of the youth issue as a problem. I see it as potential if we look at it positively and design for it. Now, how we've been accommodating workplaces, and I have no critique of that. We've designed building like this is through the skyscrapers, which I think work very well for their intended use. And we've even done our fair share of blue sky, thinking about them through this system of skypods, which looks at a simple observation that the modern high-rise is pretty much dominated by the core where we have to put our lifts and other services. So we have these vertical lifts that as the buildings get taller, they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they get a lot of the space that is really very valuable. And the idea is very simple, is to take these pods rather than the traditional lifts and put them on the outside of the building. And that creates a huge kind of potential in transforming skyscraper typologies where these vehicles can move in 3 dimensions and free up the space in the middle and allow us to start to create these very exciting typologies. But I think in parallel with that kind of thinking, when looking at the Gulf in particular, I think there's a lot of much kind of smaller scale but very interesting developments happening that are more in sync with what the millennial generation and the next generation want, how they want to work, what kind of work environments do they want to be part of, how do we accommodate the multi-generational workspace, how do we integrate technology, concern for the entire environment, concern for health. All of these things I think are really important. And I'm going to show you a little clip of some of the work that we've done in the past. This is about 5 years ago now, which is a building called The Edge in Amsterdam, called at the time the smartest and most sustainable building in the world.
Welcome to The Edge. This is certifiably the greenest office building in the world. But that just might be the least interesting part about it, because The Edge in Amsterdam is also possibly the most connected office space in the world. Working at The Edge is insane. It all starts with a smartphone app developed by the building's main tenant, the consulting firm Deloitte. When you arrive at The Edge, a camera recognizes you by your license plate for automatic access. And because it's the Netherlands, there are chargers available for electric cars. Inside, things start to get interesting because you don't have a desk. No one here does. Workspaces are assigned to you based on your schedule for the day. You have options: a work booth, a meeting room, what they call a concentration room, a sitting desk, a standing desk, a balcony desk. You can even just hang out in the sun-filled atrium all day. This concept is called hot desking, and it's what allows Deloitte to have 2,500 workers, but less than half as many desks at its Dutch headquarters. The app knows your preferences, and when you arrive at your workspace, the lights dim or brighten based on your stored settings. And any of the building's massive flat screens can be instantly paired with an iPhone or a laptop. So what makes all this possible? The LED light panels developed by Philips specifically for The Edge are actually powered by low-voltage Ethernet cables, which means every light in the building becomes its own internet-connected data hub with 28,000 sensors that makes the building and its users smarter.
The building becomes a very important part of who we are and what we want to be, and we actually...
Sorry, I'm going to fast forward a bit just to make sure.
In a nutshell, it means that work space is more focused on the tasks that need to be done and the working community that it's part of.
Another day at The Edge comes to an end. A custom security robot that looks a bit like R2-D2 wakes up and begins its patrols. Now, if only the app could automatically come conjure up a nice dinner recipe, maybe provide all the fresh ingredients at the end of the day to get you cooking. No surprise, The Edge has that too. Bon appetit.
Okay, so the building had a hugely positive reaction. I think it was a crucial point in this new workplace environment that's filled of light, that's flexible, where people can choose where they want to sit, that integrates technology, that looks after health and the environment. I think this will, you see, it becomes a key theme, not only in our work. Obviously, a lot of people are doing that, but we are kind of ahead in starting to do these things. And the idea is, how do we take this energy and bring it back into the workplace? I think, again, from my experience in recent years in working with the Gulf, I think young people that I talk to are starting to kind of, not starting, they're really hungry for this kind of new typologies and how we can enrich the workplace. And this is from another project we're doing, the headquarters of Yandex, which is a mega tech corporation in Russia. And I think at the key of this, a lot of people miss the point about that the architecture is quite crucial to all these smart buildings, but also the sense of joyfulness, activity, almost a kind of an anarchic environment that are an incentive for creativity, an incentive for collaboration. I personally particularly like this drawing because I think this brings back some of these very radical ideas from the 60s about how we celebrate the joys of building. And I think, again, for us, particularly with the demographics of the Gulf, we see a huge potential in that, and it started to reflect in our work that we're doing across the region, bringing in, you know, the different materials, the technology, the different ways of using the building, and I think that is going to be really crucial. The next aspect is living. And again, here we see similar concerns among the youth in particular in terms of the uncertainty about the future. And I think part of these are maybe, wider development issues, but there's always a role for architecture and urbanism to play. And when we started to look at that, we again go back to the prevalence of two models, one of which is the extruded skyscraper, and the other one is the cookie cutter, what we call. And they each offer different things, of course. And again, we're not interested in judgment here. We're interested in how we kind of galvanize these ideas toward new urban forms that are kind of allow us to transition to the next step in the development of Gulf cities. And to be fair, there are a lot of a new generation of buildings that differ stylistically, perhaps, but they're starting to look at kind of mid-rise, high-density models, and in varying degrees of success. But we wanted to go back a little bit, and I see I'm not going to name them. One of my professors who taught me so much along the years is one of the audience today. He'll appreciate in particular my fondness for Paul Rudolph. Is we started to go and say there was a moment in modernism where there was a reinvention of these typologies. And you can see the themes in the work of, particularly Paul Rudolph in the project for Lower Manhattan Expressway from 1967 is this separation of the vehicular activity. You can see some of the themes that I've been talking about, but particularly, the pedestrian space, the creation of these monorail vehicles that are electric and clean, and then the typology that allows every apartment or every house to have a large terrace or a garden and create all these lovely spaces in the middle. And these are subsequent renderings that were made recently that are very beautifully illustrated the potential. But what I like particularly is the kind of, when you take the step typology, the inside of it, it creates these lovely shaded spaces that I think would be particularly suitable for the environment of the Gulf. And if we look actually even a little bit earlier with the work of Athelstan Spielhaus from the Minnesota Institute of Technology, the other MIT, where this typology was kind of quite looming, and the idea was even more daring in carrying out these personal transit systems on alternate floors so you can be driven almost to your doorstep. And then looking at our ideas of solar collectors and water collection, all sorts of things that we've only recently started talking about again, and looking again about this flexibility that these typologies can offer. And what I particularly like about his work is he used these cartoons to illustrate his ideas. And you can see some of the themes from the 60s resonate a lot, the potential of the electric automobile, the clean streets, all of that. And now I think we're coming back to the moment where we're realizing how important these ideas are, but more importantly, that we need new forms of architecture and new forms of urbanism to respond to them. And then again here, I want to make an important point, because some people might say the Gulf, isn't the right place for this kind of experiment. On the contrary, it is. Across the Arab world, I would say as well, because our priorities are different. Europe is in a different kind of stage of its growth and doesn't need to grow as dynamically as we do. It doesn't need to cater for as many young people as we do. And they will need jobs, they will need education, they will need development, they will need housing, and all of these need new models. And where this project is to take us towards some of the exploration of these models. Now, Spielhaus managed to convince some people to fund, and a state to fund, a limited example of his project. Unfortunately, they chose a location that's not urban, in the middle of the swamp, to develop the idea, and ultimately was scuppered by protests from local environmental groups. However, when we started researching those typologies, you realize that actually they have been built in Kuwait. And this is Sawaber complex. For those of you who are familiar with it, this is one of the original sketches by Arthur Erickson from 1977. The building was actually built in 1981, or the buildings rather, as a form of communal housing. And I personally still like these hand sketches much more than the CGI sometimes, because they show you qualities that are more subjective, but to me it speaks of a architectural typology that's suitable for its climate and its culture. And you can see it even in this, if you remember the example when we're looking on the inside in the Paul Rudolph scheme, this is what was envisioned for Kuwait. You can see how shaded it is, and you feel like you want to be there on a hot summer day. Now, unfortunately, the project suffered from what today would be called value engineering because of the company that built it. And I owe much debt here to the research on this project to my Kuwaiti colleague and academic architect and academic Asil Al-Raqam, who's done a great work on documenting as-sawabir. But I have to say, despite the form that it was built in, you talk to anyone who lived there and they will they're learning the lessons. And I think the lesson to me here in particular is this. Sorry, I think the connection is unstable. I will give it a minute. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, Karl. I think the last thing was when you were just mentioning Asil Al-Raqam, then we had something wrong with the internet. So you might want to back to that first, I think.
Yes. So I was drawing your attention to the brilliant work that Asil has done on documenting the project and how it's deviated from the original intention, but as well its success and its ultimate destruction. And as I was saying, this is a picture I took myself last year when the last piece of it was coming around. And what I wanted to say is, I'm not one for kind of nostalgia, but I think the great lesson of this to me is it's possible to experiment with these typologies that I think are much more promising, and we can see them being done on a completely different scale to start to build up to how we re-envision the city and the Gulf city and the Arab city towards an alternative future. Now, I want to close bang on time, I think, with the last issue that I think is quite important, which is the issue of identity and representation. And I think this is a really key one. And I love this quote from one of the people who responded to me on the Twitter chat. Are you losing me again?
No, it's fine. We are asking everyone just to prepare their questions, and if you take your time.
So the quote was, people are either getting rid of everything that represents the past, or they are clinging to it more. And where is the real answer? And I think when you work in the Gulf, this question of identity and representation is always present. There's different responses to it, some of it to do with more materiality, some of which to do with patterns and colors and kind of cultural moments, and some of which are more neoclassical in nature. But I like to think in particular, and especially when we look at the extent, of the geography and the diversity of Saudi Arabia and, the urban heritage that exists there, I think we have to address these issues with both modern aspirations and a local sensibility. And I think there have been some really great examples in the past. For example, Gordon Bankshaft's SOM's National Commercial Bank in Jeddah was one of my favorite buildings, not only, in terms of the external appearance, you feel this is something totally modern, but it's totally of its place without making any kind of decorative concessions. And it has a robustness and an integrity about it. And I particularly like that kind of period and type of product, which we also see in the Hajj terminal. It's the combination of a local contextual sensibility with a sense of modernity, even with some of the quirkiest kind of example, like the flying saucer, which I hear has been in Sharjah, has been refurbished recently and put back into use. And I think really what I wanted to say about that, and would be a key theme in the development of this, and I hope it shows in our work, is we owe it to ourselves to pursue forms of modernity and innovation that are kind of, and this, I go back to our work, that are kind of consistent with this climate, culture, how do we reinterpret them without the need of pastiche? And this is a theme that you can find consistently in our work. And I would like to think that we have beginnings of a new language that would be suitable, that we hope will develop into new prototypes. And that was it, I think, right on time. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you a lot. You can keep the screen if you like. Well, we'll ask everyone to share the questions now.
Sure.
This is the first volume, right?
The first volume is going to be about the Gulf, and it will cover these 10 themes. I think once we've, developed the research a bit more, as you can see, the ideas are in various stages of completion at this stage, or hypothetical questions rather, and it's something we hope to enrich as we go forward, and hopefully with the aim of publishing it in the coming 2 years.
Yeah, great work. Okay, so if anyone have questions, so they can share it now, please. So we're just waiting if anyone have question to send it. I think someone is writing, so. We kept you late in office today.
Excuse me?
We kept you late in office today.
No, not at all, not at all. This is early for me.
Okay.
I have to say, I had a lot of questions in Kuwait and Dubai. I hope Riyadh is not being overly polite.
No, not really. We started having questions. It's not only Riyadh, by the way, but we'll have the questions now. This is from Jawahir. In our region, are the Gulf cities ready to have solar cities? Because when we design, they say that it's expensive to handle this type of knowledge.
Yeah, I think the issue of feasibility is an ongoing question, but I think I'm not dogmatic about this, but I think, with looking at particularly the long time frame, there's a lot of alternative energy sources that need to be explored. The challenge, which I think a lot of people that tend to be a little bit more preachy, is they sort of want to force cities in the Gulf to do that when there's an availability for a very cheap local energy source, so to speak. So obviously there are climate impact and environmental impact and pollution impact, but all of these, wherever I look, I see a lot of serious initiative to start to deal with them. But to my mind, I think when we start to look at that, there's a technical problem that needs to be solved, which is the very rapid degradation of the current solar technology in photovoltaics in Gulf climate. And there are already alternatives to that I think are very encouraging. And we're seeing several countries starting to build on a large scale. My main issue, I think, would be that rather than trying to install these on a project-by-project architectural scale, a few panels here, a few panels there, I think you get much better reward if you started to invest on a large scale and integrate that with the grid, because the payoff would be better, the maintenance would be easier, and ultimately we don't have an endless supply of materials for photovoltaics or solar technology in general. So we need to be very careful about how we use it in the most efficient form possible. But I think we're on the cusp now where the technologies are much more appropriate for the Gulf climate, and I'm seeing very, very big investment in that across the region.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is another question from Aya. Why divert the problem by suggesting newer ways to commute, like the sky streets, rather than reclimbing the streets?
Well, I mean, they are really connected. What we're trying to say is, and I think, again, it gets missed a lot in this discussion and the urban models that have been developed in the last 20 years. It's sort of, there's this animosity towards the car, as if you just kind of get rid of the car, then things will be okay. And when you look at the realities of the climate and the heat and things like that, you're not going to get people, you know, cycling for half an hour, 1 hour every day. You need to start to look at very serious alternative mobilities to enable this reclamation. So really, the two ideas are connected. And the ideas are connected because the technology is not waiting for us. Within 20 years, car companies might not be selling cars that you drive yourself. You know, this might be the future, and there'll be various trends that will push us towards that direction. And I think it would be a much better way of organizing how we move around the cities. But what is really important is to preserve this aspect that we need to maintain the mobility. We can't produce great cities by limiting mobility, where I think the shortcomings of a lot of the more preachy type of urbanists today is, you know, it's almost like trying to get rid of mobility. And I'll give you one example in response to this latest, the virus and COVID and the post-COVID cities, started to hear more about these 10-minute cities or 15-minute cities, that's this very parochial model of almost like a village-like type that completely doesn't understand the complexity of modern megacities and the necessity of connection across them and the scale of mobility that is required. And I personally think the real effort needs to go into alternative mobilities that still provide the mobility but allow us to liberate the streets and reclaim them in very interesting ways.
Okay, so this is a question from Abdullah. These concepts are mainly for affluent centers. What about the immigrant workers in downtowns? Would love to hear your thoughts.
No, I was very specific that I was talking about the overall growth of cities. And this can't be just about the affluent. The reason why we're looking at these models is how do we build in more ambitious scale, and once you build in economies of scale, you can afford to build bigger and better, and then you can afford to improve the livelihood of everyone that lives in these cities. And I realize that this is a contentious issue perhaps, but I'm not apologetic about it. I think, you know, this is something that occurs in cities across the world. They're becoming much more diverse and international. And we need to be ambitious about improving the lot of everyone within them. And this is why, again, I say the problem is the models, the current models that we have are very limited and able to transform cities on that scale. Now, a lot of these issues are not even just purely architectural. We're talking about what architecture can contribute, but there are obviously other aspects of it that can be developed in parallel. But ultimately, the driver for all of this is, can we re-envision this type of very ambitious kind of rapid urbanization with the right architectural and urban models to allow it to happen?
Okay, so this question from Seema: What about thinking about the human scale and building multiple layers in the city vertically?
That's a very interesting question, and it's one that I've heard in different forms. And my answer to it is starts from a simple observation. To me, I think high-rise buildings are human scale because, you know, we're one of the probably the only species, somebody once said to me, termites build towers, but anyway, we're the only species that consciously builds, you know, things in this form on that scale. The idea is how we inhabit them in a way that's layered, complex, three-dimensional. And if you actually look at a lot of old Arab cities, they already had this dynamism. And I remember, for example, take a city like, you know, a Mamluk city like Trablus, Tripoli in Lebanon, where you know, things happen at the street level, but you realize things happen at rooftops, things happen at balcony level. It's not something that didn't exist historically in Arab cities. Now, obviously, it's not the same scale, but I think there's a very interesting organic three-dimensionality to the Arab city that we'll actually only be reclaiming. I don't think if even of this as a kind of a concept borrowed from the West. I think there's a very, tectonically speaking, there's a very interesting three-dimensional logic to the growth of Arab cities historically, or Middle Eastern cities, that could be very informative in that respect. And ultimately, the scale is the scale that we make. If we can inhabit them on multiple levels, rather than them being just dominant symbols and connected and all that sort of thing, I think it's much more about taming it to this human scale.
Okay, we have still about 10 questions.
Please.
Okay, so this question from Hatun: how can culture impact the environment?
That's a really interesting one. And I presume we're talking about the built environment over here. And again, the reason why I started with that is, for me, this form of socialization, and I don't want to be romantic about it, it's not the seed that you see in souks and you know, outside the mosque or whatever. It's something that's quite part of Arab culture, Middle Eastern culture, the regional culture. And if you look at a place like Lebanon, the way the houses extend to the outside, even in cities, and people can talk to each other, even with, you know, between apartment blocks, I think there's a certain element of sociability that you always used to exist in these cities that has kind of been eroded by very expedient ways of construction that don't allow for that. Now, the objection that I normally have is that perhaps people in the Gulf, locals at least, have kind of more conservative, more different social traditions. And I say, of course, so be it. This is, you have to work for the context that you are in, but it doesn't mean, you know, the stereotypical understanding, if people are more conservative by disposition, it means they have to be antisocial. I find that, you know, almost like a caricature. If how design for the right form of the socialization in the right environment. And obviously we have to pay attention as well to the huge scale of rate of social change and how we integrate that with architecture. And as you will see actually from a lot of these expedient forms of construction historically in the region, they weren't even done by locals or local architects or Arab architects. They were imported from the other places precisely because of their expedience and because people didn't want to kind of expect too much, let's say, of the context that they're designing for. So you get this very simplistic solution. And I think really what I want to say is we can do much better.
Yeah. This question from Sierra: how can we deal urbanization with the current climatical issues and with the current situation? I think she means the COVID.
No, I think she's probably talking about climate because she said climate, but I'll answer anyway, which is a really great question. And it's basically, there are two schools of thoughts, one of which says because of the climate challenge, we all have to stop doing everything. And that is not a solution. You have to think of what is the right solution that take these problems into account. So you can build buildings with alternative technologies, alternative energy forms. But more importantly, there's this notion that small is beautiful now. That, you know, if you do small interventions, then, you know, we won't have a big impact. Well, yes, you won't have a big impact, as in you won't have a big solution, right? And any new technology, even like the cleanest technology, alternative technology you want to do, alternative systems of building, in order to make it economical, you need to build on scale, a factor that gets missed. So what often happens is we get projections, again, from Europe, where the scale of the ambition is different because their cities are, you know, already developed, and they can do things in a piecemeal fashion. We are looking at huge demographic challenges. We are looking at challenges in providing housing, education, hospitalization, culture across the board for very young generations, very growing, fast, rapidly growing context. What do? Do we just cram people into the same space that we have? We have to respond ambitiously. And this is an imperative on so many different levels. And with this ambition, I think comes the economies of scale that allow us to introduce these technologies, that allow us to build sustainably, that allow us to build in a cleaner fashion, so they are not disconnected. Let me answer the COVID one as well, because I think this is an important challenge with a lot of pessimists now, sort of saying the city is dead. It's from people who never understood what the city is for, you know? Cities are resilient, cities are adaptable. And you know, if cities were just about kind of shutting them down with minor inconvenience, like nobody would have built a city in the Gulf, you know? Why would you build a city where the temperature can get to 48, 49, Kuwait over 50? We're adaptable, we're resilient, we are resourceful. And what's going to happen now is there will be a period in which there's going to be a lot of anxiety, but I think ultimately the genuine recovery is about coming up with big ideas about how we are adaptable. If we start to lose the, people not wanting to work in the city, there'll be a void that will be filled by something else. And the question is, do we allow that to happen organically? Do we lead it, come up with ideas of how we invigorate it, or is it a combination of the two, which is kind of would be my idea. And there are many examples of from history, where you can see cities utterly losing their economic raison d'etre, and then rediscovering something else, okay? In Lebanon, all our economy was based on the Murex and the trade with the Phoenician. Then it became about the silk. Then it became about something else. Ultimately, we're in a moment we're trying to look for something else now. If you look at the growth of these cities across the Mediterranean and the Arab world, you'll see their economic role, and by definition, the cultural and social manifestation of this underlying economic factors will vary and very radically over time, and will have a lot of dynamism. And I think this is very key. We need to start thinking dynamically. We shouldn't think of our cities as kind of frozen in time, not only in the Gulf, but outside where maybe the past weighs more heavily. We need to have this ambition and the vision to kind of think of them as living creature and contributing, much like every generation before, to their growth and reinvention.
Okay, this question from Aya. Do you think cities will end up the same if they transformed their streets into the skypod techniques as the future solutions?
I mean, let me just say that by no means is a solution. It's just a provocative idea to start to think about these different ways of doing things. What I think ultimately will happen is every city will start to pick different modes of transport as these come in. They will pick different ways and urban models and architectural models that work with this mobility. And this will depend on their local culture, on their economic distribution, on their physical morphology, their size even. If you live in a city of 100,000, the complexity of mobility systems they require is not the same like in a city of 7 or 8 million. So the question is not, let's not be afraid of the uniformity. We're on the cusp of a moment of historical transformation. And I think we can always look at the solutions that are more appropriate. Now, as in with every technology, there'll be a lot of flashy ideas that disappear within 2 or 3 years, but there will be things that stick. And maybe the things we stick won't be any of the things that I looked at. But ultimately, I think we're a moment where we realize there's a need for that. And this is really the kind of the central thesis and provocation with this, is how can architecture respond and probably even dictate some of these technologies and by consequence, the way cities grow.
This question from Hind: what are the best tools that you would use to revitalize deteriorated urban areas when putting in consideration local contemporary culture?
I mean, this is largely dependent on the context. I think particularly in the Gulf, there's obviously looming economic challenges because I think in many places we're already in the post-oil economy, and how the economy is being diversified and the economy drives a lot of that. I think how each context responds primarily to this transformation will drive this sense of how this version of revitalization happens. Unfortunately, I think in some contexts they've been a little bit insulated from this need to revitalize. So you can see whole quarters almost abandoned. I don't want to mention specific places not to offend anyone, but I think anyone who knows the Gulf very well will know what I'm talking about. But I think really we're now at a moment where, because there's so much being demanded by this younger generation and their aspirations are different and the circumstances which we can provide for them are not the same like they used to be in the 70s and the 80s, this will filter in organically, and you can see examples of that in a lot of places across the Gulf and across the Arab world, where you see inventiveness, you see dynamism. People don't necessarily want to always like go and be in a new building. They might renovate an old building. All sorts of ideas are emerging, and I think in a funny sort of way, as the role of state shrinks in terms of the provider of economic opportunity, it's probably a much bigger incentive for this level of resourcefulness.
So we still have some questions. This question from Muhammad. Can you please give us some notes about Muscat through your experience?
I'm not very familiar with Muscat, except that you know, I've been there a couple of times. I love the geography, the geology, the nature, all of that. But I'm not really an expert. I'm hoping for more opportunities to visit and learn more, but it would be very arrogant of me to suggest anything specific without any intimate knowledge. I think it's a place where I'm hugely impressed by the potential over there. And I would love to have the opportunity, perhaps, you know, and in the future, I would be able to respond to the question in a more convincing manner.
Sure. Okay, this question from Hussam: how could we solve the issue of the humidity of the cities next to the sea, like Dubai, for example?
A great one. That is a great one, because a lot of the challenges that we've been having, you know, when you work in dry climates, this passive cooling techniques that we are talking about work much better in dry climates. And these are really important. You know, I've worked on projects from China to India to Gulf, Beirut, Europe, London. And the challenge is always, when we start to talk about in hot cities, these techniques, is humidity is really, because, you know, in other places you can use evaporative cooling, you can use water, which helps give you at least the feel that the, I think, to me, and the reason why I wanted to start with the examples that I talked to you about how we reinvent this urban fabric, the impact in those climates of surface radiation is shading is absolutely phenomenal. And with these models that we're developing, kind of reducing the surface radiation does cut a lot of the negative impact of the climate that plays, but as well orienting things to benefit much better from the impact of ventilation. And doing it in such a way, obviously, because you always have the problem in the Gulf, particularly in large parts of the season, you get the hot winds, and that's not useful for you. So if you factor all of these together we're seeing very interesting technologies using renewables for external dehumidification that are producing fantastic results. Now, if you're using them, obviously, by utilizing fossil fuels or things like that, is obviously totally nonsensical. It's going to have a detrimental impact. But when you start to look, you know, at the adoption and large scale of renewable technologies through solar and looking at even the potential of fuel cells and things like that, I think technology will also play an important role. So it's a combination. There is no easy answer. We've tested different things, just short of full external air conditioning, which I think would be totally nonsensical. But I think that, to me, is definitely one of the areas that deserve kind of more attention. I've been doing a lot of work on it. But the short answer is the combination of all these factors is ultimately also a very important social one, is everyone expects comfort to be like 22, 23 degrees, which is, you have to forget about this mindset. You have to start to think in these median spaces or external environments. If we can get the temperature to a feel of 28, then that's perfectly tolerable. You don't need to be freezing in air conditioning internally. So part of it is as well management of expectations. and then getting us through our simulations. We've been hitting this 28 degrees mark through these various technologies, particularly in humid environments. And I think my personal feel is technology will also help us a lot.
Okay, what are this is from Zayed. What are the consequences of such visions on the social culture issues? Technology is ignoring the physical context.
I hope I didn't give you this impression. I think what I was trying to say is how we tie up technology is going to come anyway, whether we do something about it or not, is how do we then use this technology in a ways that then can be socially meaningful, that can be culturally meaningful, that can make people feel having more of a say in their cities, more of a role in their cities, better environment to live in. But we cannot expect those cities to look like what cities look like today. They might end up looking like that, but I think there's always going to be unexpected results. And let me take you back 100 years. Again, when the cities we take for granted today and the way they are formed, when they were proposed, they weren't very neutral. This image, for example, over here, this wasn't, a neutral image that people, and I'll get to it in a second, this wasn't a neutral image that people, thought. It was very radical, it's very breakthrough. Today, it's banal, it's what we know, right? But this is the nature of cities, they reinvent themselves. So to me, it's almost about responding to the technology challenge by kind of finding very innovative cultural and social and architectural solutions to them that can combine these factors. One very important thing though, why do I go and we as a team, we go out, we talk to people, we consult, we discuss, we challenge ourselves through dialogue with other professionals and even artists and writers, is we can't be arrogant and dictate these things top down. We maybe propose ideas that are provocative and we hear, and some of them will invariably be shut down. But I think we're at a moment where we really need to start to appreciate with the whole kind of social mode of interaction that we have through social network and digital economy and things like that. You really have to be attentive, consultative, and produce things through more kind of dialogue. And this is really effectively what I'm trying to do today.
So we just have 4 questions to go. This question from Sierra: how about the urbanization under the ground instead of high and mid-rise buildings?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in Gulf climates that could be interesting, but obviously I think whenever you start to look at underground, and I've seen a lot of theoretical projects on that, is how do you solve the question of light and ventilation without huge use of energy and artificial things. And ultimately, I think the main thing with any of these is there isn't one answer for everything. I think this is the main message. I think what are the issues that we have as a result of the basic assumption that we take about the city today, and what interesting results can we have is started to manipulate these and start changing some of them. So let me give you a very simple one, right? The way we build cities now is we have a plot. In many cities, it's usually a square or a rectangle defined by a network of public streets around it, and then we can just extrude that vertically. Now, if in the real estate and the legislation we allowed for these connectivities, are they going to happen? Are we going to encourage them? Are we getting to get more interesting results as a result of that? And really, some of the drivers for what we're trying to do is, again, try to get, solar radiation in the Gulf is a huge issue. And the more you kind of passively stop it, provide this kind of shading and things like that, the more it will nurture possibilities for interaction, for commerce, for all sorts of things, even for pedestrians and other activities. But ultimately, it's not a one-size kind of recipe. All sorts of ideas can be implemented with this. I mean, we're even working on things with floating cities, which would be the topic for another lecture, inshallah.
Yes. This question from Sarah: what do you think the next step in Saudi Arabia should be towards developing an urban infrastructure that could afford to host the aforementioned models?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting one. And I think I never quite understood the prevalence of the low-rise model. I mean, I do understand some of it, but I think it almost feels like, and I'm not, you know, shy about development or scale of development. We look at somewhere like Riyadh, which seems to extend indefinitely horizontally. I think what it really needs, and I feel like, you know, I hope I don't sound like a total foreign consultant kind of suggesting something that totally doesn't work, is I think there are very interesting mid-rise, mid-density urban models, mixed use, that combine residential with cultural and workplaces and things like that, that would be fantastic step forward. They would be cheaper to build, they would create more sense of activity, they will, you know, just the process of building them will generate a lot of economic activities and employment and things like that, but they could also start to transform the fabric of the city in very interesting ways. And not to be arrogant and assume that this is not happening, and I can assure you there's a lot of things that are already in the cards and are already being planned. So I think there is awareness about this type of development. Inevitably, I think the conversation that we have in Saudi Arabia always revolve around, you know, can we get denser? Can we get denser? Where there's a sort of a natural tendency not to go too dense, which is a kind of a cultural sense to a certain extent. But the conversation needs to be had, and these dialogues need to be had, and the merits of these higher density mid-rise developments really need to be illustrated, because I think they would enrich the city really.
Okay, so last question from Saleh. How important is to share the local community with decision about the city planning, and how can we share them with that?
Yeah, I mean, this is very important, as I mentioned a few questions ago, which is, you know, you need to know who you are designing for, what their aspirations are, what they want. Any architect can just, or decision making can kind of make some fancy sketches and design all these utopias that nobody wants to be part of, right? You need to listen, but as well, not to be patronizing and say, you know, draw me the image of your house, because, you know, you wouldn't go to someone who's not a doctor and say, how would you treat me if you were a doctor? There's still a level for expertise, but it's about the dialogue, understanding what the real aspirations are, and how can we in our professional capacity satisfy them, and satisfy them not always according to the same repeated models that I think are exhausting themselves. But ultimately, I think with sessions like this, and there's a lot more opportunities for dialogue today, the voices of the youth, you know, will have a very important role in shaping that through demands, through aspirations, through visions, through, you know, suggestions, all sorts of possibilities of dialogue. Ultimately, you know, that healthy public dialogue is key to this, in my opinion.
So we finally finished all the questions. Hopefully we wasn't polite, as you mentioned at the beginning.
They were really great questions, and apologies for keep saying Riyadh, you know, because
that's okay.
The series is, you know, Dubai, Kuwait, and I thought we'll call it Riyadh because it's 3 cities rather than 3 countries.
Yeah, it's fine.
Apologies if I offended someone who's not from Riyadh, and hopefully I'll make it up to you. Invite me. I was meant to visit Jeddah just before COVID started. Unfortunately, I couldn't do that visit because it was cancelled because COVID. But hopefully, I will be able once.
Very soon. Thank you again for this presentation. We are looking for the book. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone who was with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.